The next book I'll be exploring in the next few videos. I don't know how many videos I'm likely going to record, as often I never know how many videos I'll record from one book. But anyways, the next book I'll be looking at is a book titled Theologico-Political Treatise. The original title is in a different language. It is Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. It's a book written by a guy by the name Baruch Spinoza, but he also went by the name Benedictus de Spinoza. Now, this guy was he was a Dutch, but his parents were originally from Portugal, and they were Jewish. This guy lived between 1632, sorry, to 1677. So it's an ancient text, but not as ancient as most of the texts that I've looked at in this channel. Of course, often I prefer texts that are at least 1,000 years old. I decided to look at this book, and it was because of me reading Maimonides, The Guide for the Perplexed. There's a way this book is kind of like a response to Maimonides, and I have to mention that Baruch Spinoza seems to have been a student of Maimonides as well. So he wrote this book is kind of like he's countering some of the arguments that Maimonides makes in the Guide for the Perplexed, and that's why I decided to go to this book, even though it's not very ancient. It's like maybe 400 years old. Yeah, but that's a long time, of course. Now, this book was published. The, this book was published in the year 1670. It was just a few years before Spinoza died. And it's important to point out that this book created a huge storm in the Netherlands. And that was because of the ideas it was passing. Remember, this is the time when the Netherlands was very, very religious, very Christian, as a society, that is. Most people were very religious, and the state, even though it was a very advanced state of that time. Religion and state were kind of like more the same thing. There was no huge separation between the two. Even when it was claimed to be the case in the Netherlands, the ecclesiastes, as Spinoza calls them, that's the religious leaders, had a lot of sway on the political trends and political topics and political environment of the state. They kind of like everything that happened in the state. The politician had to listen carefully to the religious leaders and do what they thought was the right thing to do. Now, because of this environment and the ideas that Spinoza was espousing in the book, he decided not to publish the book under his name. He published it under a pseudonym. And even the person who published it didn't publish, the publisher didn't publish under their name. In fact, he published under name Enricus Kunrant. And they also did not mention that the book was published in Netherlands, but Hamburg in Germany, I think. They were trying to avoid situations. And he also did not write the book in the Dutch language. He decided to write the book in Latin. So I read somewhere that his knowledge of the Latin language wasn't like the perfect, but he did a very good job of expressing himself in that language in the book. So all these they were doing to avoid censorship. Even though they did all that, though, the book was banned in Netherlands, and copies that were already in the bookshops were collected at some point and banned, and there was a lot of uproar in the society about this book that in fact they basically described it as work of the devil. But if you read the book itself, in today's standards, is very far from what even a very religious person can call the work of the devil. Because Spinoza does not argue against the existence of God, even though during that time most people described him as an atheist, but he wasn't. He was not. If you read his work, you realize he very much believed in the existence of God. And in fact, many of his arguments were kind of like trying to establish the existence of God in a way that is more rational. This was the beginning of what they called the Enlightenment age, and many philosophers and thinkers of this time, 17th century, were these kind of people who still believed in God, but they tried to argue or to make arguments that were attempting to establish God in a rational way. Reason was a big thing then, that we should leave out these superstition and then start seeing God in a more rational way. It was basically the argument of the people of this, of the thinkers of this time. And Spinoza belonged in that group. He wasn't an atheist, but because of the things he was saying in the book, people were quick to call him an atheist. But why did they find his content so repulsive that they called him an atheist? If you read the book, you realize that Spinoza was trying to a large extent, he was challenging the authority of the authority and the credibility and the accuracy of the ecclesiastes, that is the religious leaders. And he didn't just challenge the authority and credibility and the accuracy of the ecclesiastes of his time, that people who lived around that time in the Netherlands. He went far back to Moses, and that was very unacceptable. In fact, I think some people would have accepted for him to challenge the ecclesiastes of his time, but him deciding to go as far back as Moses, that was like, no. Now you are going to people who have always been assumed to have been so accurate, so credible, to have the authority. They spoke to God directly, and that's not acceptable. So such ideas are the ideas that made Spinoza's book to be very controversial. Now, over the years, the book, even though it was banned and people could not access it, in fact, the Catholic Church included it in the list of books that were not accepted to be read. Even then, the book went on to become a book that is well known, especially among the philosophers. And yeah, it's a book that is very powerful when you read it. It challenges the way you look at, especially the Bible, and and the teachings of the prophets. Now, I'll take you through the major chapters. The major chapters, we have one chapter he talks about of prophecy, and he tries to explain what prophecy is. And in this chapter, in fact, he seemed to be challenging Maimonides' description of what prophecy is. He's kind of like disagreeing with how Maimonides describes prophecy. And if you watch my previous videos, you most likely have watched a video where I talk about Maimonides' take on prophecy. Now, Spinoza have a different take. While Maimonides still has this understanding or belief that prophets were people who kind of had, even though not directly like other people think, that these people had this divine revelation, Spinoza kind of like tries to say not really. And even though Maimonides still tries to recognize these prophets as if they were global, Spinoza tries to explain to us why they were not really global, why the prophets of other societies were as equal as the prophets of the Jews. So he makes such kind of arguments. He also talk about Christ. And under Christ, he make an argument that I've never thought about. Like, Jesus Christ has never been, nobody recognizes him as a prophet, except the Muslims recognize Jesus as a prophet. And he goes ahead to say why that is. He has his own ideas. We might have a video talking about that. He talks about the prophets. In chapter 2, he goes further into who these prophets were. And he kind of dismantles their where they get their authority from, like kind of something like that. And this, as I've said, these are some of the things that made the book very controversial. And some people were like, this is an atheist, and his book should not be read. And then he talks about, in chapter 3, he talks about the peculiarity of the Jewish prophecy, or the prophets who are among the Hebrew people. And then he kind of, while Maimonides gives them this place that most people who are in Christian society, and of course the Jewish society, and to some extent the Muslim society, gives them that they have this special place and they were global. As I've said, he tries to show that no, they were not peculiar. Maybe they stand out because somehow we ran into their stories, and the other stories can kind of disappear into the past, and we never heard about them. And then he talks of the divine law. To some extent, he agrees with Maimonides about the laws of Moses, about them being made for the commonwealth. I think Maimonides kind of makes the same argument. I think for most of us who came into Christianity, or were born into Christianity, of course, the understanding of the Mosaic law is that it applies, and I guess the Jewish believes the same, or some of them, I don't know, I'm not an expert in that area, but they believe that these laws apply to date. But then he breaks down, and then he brings out something that even me, it's coming to me very recently, that the religion of the Jewish were more or less the same as the state, or they were one with the state. And the idea of them being separate is a very recent one, very recent. Yeah, I use very carefully or loosely, I have to say, because recent could be thousands of years. But the idea is it's not the original belief that the Mosaic law, the divine law, as it were, is separate from the Commonwealth or the state. They were basically the same thing. So in that area, he kind of like agrees with Maimonides. And of course, he talks about ceremonial laws, which are more like the same thing. But of course, we have the ceremonial laws, the divine laws, and then he talks about those. And if you find different copies of this book, in some copies, you will have an additional sub-treatise, which is more of work that Spinoza was working on, but he died before he completed it. And in this copy I'm going to go through, it talks more of the nature of government, basically, what necessitates the existence of government and sovereign, and how different types of government function, and he tries to make us understand democracy, aristocracy, what is the other one, monarchy, and all this he talks about in a very detailed, and I'll say it's the first piece of text I've read about these three types of government that has really made me have a deeper understanding of them. Yeah, so this is the book we are going to be looking at in the next few videos. I'm trying to see whether there's something I should mention when it comes to introduction. Yeah, so that's the book we are going to look at.